Hey, number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are back with Lex Fridman podcast, and we're going to react and sort of provide commentary to some of the statements that are made by both him and his guests, as we always do. So this is really the third episode that I'm making about this because, let me show you. I have a few episodes, but specifically with this guest, who is Graham, I finally learned how to pronounce it, Graham Hancock. As you see, this was my first episode. They were introducing the concept of, or the hypothesis of an Ice Age civilization. Then I made a second episode, this one here, where we were discussing the idea of an extinction, global extinction event, or sort of a civilization ending event, and how the sort of ideas that he proposes. And as always, when I listen and react to these things, I always want you to use your own critical thinking. I am, of course, sharing my opinions. Sometimes I'll be like, that's a fascinating theory. Other times I'll be like, no, I don't think that's right. I think that's complete nonsense. You know me, I will say what I think. And I'm not someone who immediately follows or believes anything anyone says just because they say it confidently and using high-level vocabulary, but because that doesn't necessarily prove that they know what they're talking about. It just proves that they are good speakers at the end of the day. But at the same time, I don't also immediately reject anything that doesn't follow the way we understand the past right now, because that would be wrong when it comes to any sort of academic discourse. At the end of the day, any theory, any hypothesis that you decide to present, I'm more than happy to listen, and I don't think that there is any such thing as silly questions or things that you're not supposed to say. No, please, do say it all. Speak freely is what I say. And without further ado, massive thanks to Lex Fridman, as always, for producing very entertaining content. And let's see what they have to say today about two specific sections. The one about the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx of Giza, and then, if we have time, if that doesn't take too long, the one about how the Great Pyramid was built.
Well, can you actually describe the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids and what you find most mysterious and interesting about them?
Well, first of all, the astronomy. And here I must pay tribute to two individuals, actually three individuals in particular. One of them is John Anthony West, passed away in 2018. He was the first person in our era to begin to wonder if the Sphinx was much older than it had been. Actually, he got that idea from a philosopher called Schwaller de Lubicz, who'd noticed what he thought was water erosion on the body of the Sphinx. John West picked that up, and he was a great amateur Egyptologist himself. He spent most of his life in Egypt, and he was hugely versed in ancient Egypt. And when he looked at the Sphinx and at the strange scalloped erosion patterns and the vertical fissures, particularly in the trench around the Sphinx, he began to think maybe Schwaller was right. Maybe there was some sort of flooding here. And that's when he brought Robert Schoch, second person I'd like to recognize, geologist at Boston University. He brought Schoch to Giza, and Schoch was the first geologist to stick his neck out, risk the ire of Egyptologists, and say, well, it looks to me like the Sphinx was exposed to at least 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. As Schoch's calculations have continued, as he's continued to be immersed in this mystery, he's continuously pushed that back. And he's now, again, looking at the date of around 12,500 years ago, during the Younger Dryas, for the creation of the Great Sphinx.
Well, the ire of Egyptologists doesn't matter. At the end of the day, I challenge oftentimes academics, and I do it publicly, and I point fingers, but I present receipts. So that's one thing that I do. And even when I speak sort of outside my field, which I always make clear, at the end of the day, I share my opinions, and if they hate me for it, I don't particularly care. With that being said, because once again, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of debate and discussion, it will always be the cornerstone of advancement. If you are confident and sure about whatever findings that you have, or whatever historical idea that you have presented as the ultimate truth, then you will have no problems with people challenging it, because you'll just debunk them. Piece of cake, right? That's the idea. So if people are like, no, you're not supposed to say, you can't speak, then I'm thinking you're not really confident with your findings. And then you're just trying to protect a narrative. I don't particularly care what academics think of me or any of you when we ask questions. And at the same time, I will strongly side with academics when they have the truth that is confirmed by evidence. And then you have some people that are trying to cancel them because the truth doesn't fit their agendas. Then I will stand with academia. It's a very case-by-case scenario.
And then, of course, this is the period of the wet Sahara, the humid Sahara. The Sahara was a completely different place during
That's
the Ice
correct.
Age. There were
That's
rivers
correct.
in it. There were lakes in it. It was fertile. It was possibly densely populated. And there was a lot of rain. There's not no rain in Giza today, but there's relatively little rain. The next person, not enough rain to cause that erosion damage on the Sphinx. The next person who needs to be mentioned in this context is Robert Bauval. Robert and I have co-authored a number of books together. Unfortunately, Robert has been very ill for the last 7 years. He's got a very bad chest infection. And I think also that Robert became very demoralized by the attacks of Egyptologists on his work. But Robert is the genius. And it does take a genius sometime to make these connections, because nobody noticed it before, that the 3 pyramids of Giza are laid out on the ground in the pattern of the 3 stars of Orion.
Orion, I see, yeah.
And skeptics will...
That does show an incredible, like, of course, I'm aware of this. This is something that has been going around for decades, really, probably longer than that. And it does show a very advanced knowledge of astronomy, like incredible precision. And now, the precision... With that being said, it's important to be careful when we see people, I don't know if he's going to do that, but sometimes people go a little too overboard with it. It is impressive, and I do believe it's absolutely deliberate. I believe this. With that being said, when people say, oh, but no, look, it's actually correct to the infinite decimal point, then they are exaggerating, because at the end of the day, when you look at a map, the distances that we are discussing in comparison to the astronomical references, that you could really not miss it. When you go down to too much of a small numeral, then it's impossible to miss it. So at the end of the day, it just becomes something said for shock factor. But it is still impressive, because it denotes a highly advanced civilization that had a high level of understanding of astronomy and the laws of the cosmos, up to a certain extent.
Will say, well, you can find any buildings and line them up with any stars you want, but Orion actually isn't any old constellation. Orion was the god Osiris in the sky. He was, the ancient Egyptians called the Orion constellation Sahu, and they recognize it as the celestial image of the god Osiris. So
yeah, I think it's deliberate.
What's being copied on the ground is the belt of a deity, of a celestial deity. It's not just a random constellation. And then when we take precession into account, you find something else very intriguing happening. First of all, you find that the exact orientation of the pyramids as it is today, and pretty much as it was when they're supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago, it's not precisely related to how Orion's belt looked at that time. There's a bit of a twist. They're not quite right. But as you precess the stars backwards, as you go back and back and back, and you come to around 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, in the Younger Dryas, you find that suddenly they lock perfectly. They match perfectly with the 3 pyramids on the ground. And that's the same moment.
That's something I would have to double check.
That the Great Sphinx, an equinoctial monument, aligned perfectly to the rising sun on the spring equinox. Anybody can test this for themselves. Just go to Giza on the 21st of March, be there before dawn, stand behind the Sphinx, and you will see the sun rising directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. But the question is, what constellation was behind the Sphinx? And 12,500 years ago, it was the constellation of Leo. And actually, the constellation of Leo has a very Sphinx-like look. And I and my colleagues are pretty sure that the Sphinx was originally a lion entirely, and that it, over the time...
I have read about this. I didn't go deeply into it, but I have read that the original head, because the head is smaller, objectively, it does look like it's been carved on top of a pre-existing, already completed monument which had a proportionate head, whereas the Sphinx now doesn't have a proportionate head. The head of the woman is smaller. So I did hear about this, and it is a very interesting idea.
Thousands of years, it became damaged, it became eroded, particularly the part of it that sticks out, the head. There were periods when the Sphinx was completely covered in sand, but still the head stuck out. By the time you come to the 4th dynasty, when the Great Pyramids are supposedly built, by the time you come to the 4th dynasty, the head of the lion, original lion head, would have been a complete mess. And we suggest that it was then recarved into a pharaonic head. Egyptologists think it was the pharaoh Khafre, but there's no real strong resemblance, but it's definitely wearing the Nemes headdress of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. And we think that that's the result of a recarving of what was originally not only a lion-bodied, but also a lion-headed monument. It wouldn't make sense if you create an equinoctial marker in the time of Khafre, 4,500 years ago, and the Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. I mean, it's 270 feet long and 70 feet high, and it's looking directly at the rising sun on the equinox. If you create it then, you'd be more likely to create it in the shape of a bull, because that was the age of Taurus, when the constellation of Taurus housed the sun on the spring equinox. So why is it a lion?
Well, it is difficult, though, to not overimpose or superimpose our own perceptions. And this is something that is real and valid when it comes to the medieval period, when it comes to ancient Rome, classical antiquity, Mesoamerican civilization, East Asian civilizations, African civilizations, you name it. At the end of the day, what's logical to us doesn't automatically translate into, oh, well, then that would be logical for someone 5,000 years ago in a completely different culture, in a completely different world. This is why I really, really like the idea of looking at the past, not necessarily as a different moment in time, but also as a foreign/alien country in space. Because at the end of the day, if you now, say, imagine you are from America, Germany, or the UK, I just mentioned the three higher pools of viewerships for my channel to have a statistical chance of guessing right. If you're from any of these countries and you move to Japan, everything will feel alien and different to you. Well, that's how the past would feel to us, even if we don't move spatially. So if you are from Germany and then you go to Germany 3,000 years ago, it would feel like a different country. The language would be different, the pronunciation would be different, the culture, the architecture, the looks, lots of things would be different. Now, of course, there is, in a lot of countries, there is a reasonable genetic and ethnic continuity, so it doesn't necessarily mean that people would look different. That really depends on the country. There are countries where that would be the case and countries where that would not be the case, but still the hairstyles, maybe even the variety of phenotypic traits, lots of things would feel like you are in a different country altogether, if not a different planet. So I don't particularly enjoy nor like the idea of, well, to me, A plus B makes sense that they make C, and therefore this is what makes logical sense from the perspective of people 5,000 years ago. You don't know that, I don't know that. There are religious connotations, there are cultural connotations, linguistic connotations that we process without subconsciously that make us think, well, yeah, that makes sense. But we don't even realize that what we are saying is a byproduct of our time and cultural location in the world. We're all children of our time. So it is very likely that since their culture, their religion, their languages, their reasoning functioned so different than ours, then something that to us makes sense to them would make absolutely no sense whatsoever. An interesting example of that would be, for instance, the Chinese or Japanese character for to rest. And to rest is a person and a tree. And possible, it's from our point of view, a bed would make more sense. But maybe for someone 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, somewhere in China, and they are most likely farmers. They've been working all day. They're outside and they want to rest, and they use the tree to kind of lay like this and get a little rest before they need to go back. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And that's just a little thing. There is a lot like that.
And again, we think that's because of that observation of the skies and putting on the ground as above, so below, putting on the ground an image of the sky at a particular time. Now, the fact that the Giza plateau, it's a fact, of course, that Egyptologists completely dispute, but the fact that the principal monuments of the Giza plateau, the three great pyramids and the Great Sphinx, all lock astronomically on the date of around 10,500 BC, to me is most unlikely to be an accident. And actually, if you look at computer software at the sky at that time, you'll see that the Milky Way is very prominent and seems to be mirrored on the ground by the River Nile. I suggest that may be one of the reasons amongst many why Giza was chosen as the site for this very special place.
Wouldn't that be completely anecdotal, though? I mean, it's not like people have It's not like the ancient Egyptians had control of what the River Nile looked like, and not to mention, is there really that much of a connection between the Nile River and the Milky Way? I personally don't see it, but maybe it's just me.
So the point I want to make is that an astronomical design on the ground, which memorializes a very ancient date, does not have to have been done 12,500 years ago. If from the ancient Egyptian point of view, you're there 4,500 years ago, and there's a time 8,000 years before that, which is very, very, very important to you, you could use astronomical language and megalithic architecture to memorialize that date on the Giza plateau, which is what we think we're looking at.
I don't know, it's a little weak. Again, I'm very intrigued with the ideas he presents, and some ideas I think I'm open to those possibilities. But 8,000 years ago, it's such a long time before this decision of building that it does sound very unlikely to me. In fact, I would find it much more likely that by this time, when they're building the pyramids, their astronomical understandings are advanced. As you say, they create a connection. I do agree with that one, that they possibly create a connection with gods of their religion. And so they decide, hey, we are capable of doing this. Let's mimic the stars above to the ground below, and let's recreate a sort of map to represent Orion, because maybe Orion had a significance, very important significance. I do believe that Orion has a central significance, not only when it comes to ancient civilizations like the Egyptians, but even the Romans, and even biblical stuff. And I could make a dedicated video. I will. I know I always say that I will make a dedicated video to why I think Orion is central to a lot of different religions and cultures and civilizations. So I have absolutely no problem agreeing with that. But the idea that it's also somehow a way to reference symbolically the event of the Younger Dryas that occurred 8,000 years before that, why did they wait 8,000 years to do that? Maybe they didn't have the tech, I suppose, but after 8,000 years, if that's how long it took, it's a little weak. Last but not least, one thing I want to say about the Sphinx is the fact that, yes, Ridley Scott was wrong. A cannonball from Napoleon did not break the nose. That's nonsense, and we have images that show a broken nose that predate Napoleon. Thank you. Just wanted to say that.
Except for one thing, and that's the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. And we're pretty sure that the Sphinx, at least, does date back to 12,500 years ago. And with it, the megalithic temples, the so-called Valley Temple, which stands just to the east and just to the south.
Valley Temple of Khafre.
And the Sphinx Temple, which stands directly in front of the Sphinx. The Sphinx Temple has largely been destroyed, but the Valley Temple, attributed to Khafre on no good grounds whatsoever, is a huge megalithic construction with blocks of limestone that weigh up to 100 tons each. And yet it has been remodeled, refaced with granite. There are granite blocks that are placed on top of the core limestone blocks. And those core limestone blocks were already eroded when the granite blocks were put there. Why? Because the granite blocks have actually been purposefully and deliberately cut to fit into the erosion marks on the, we believe, much older megalithic blocks there.
Fascinating.
So I think Giza is a very complicated site. I would never seek to divorce the dynastic ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramids. They were closely involved in the construction of the Great Pyramids as we see them today. But what I do suggest is that there were very low platforms on the Giza plateau that are much older, and that when we look at the three Great Pyramids, we're looking at a renovation and a restoration and a enhancement of much older structures that had existed on the Giza plateau for a much longer period before that. Actually, the Great Pyramid is built around a natural hill. And that natural hill might have been seen as the original primeval mound to the ancient Egyptians.
So does he think that because I'm not 100% sure, and therefore I can't provide a critique if I don't understand the point, is this primordial mound that he proposes has been existing way longer than the building of the pyramids and, of course, Egyptian dynastic dynastic civilization, was this artificial, was it man-made, or was it a natural hill that had significance? If I don't know that, then it's kind of difficult to respond to that.
The idea is that the Sphinx was there long before the pyramids, and the pyramids were built by the Egyptian to celebrate further
it's possible,
an already holy place.
Yeah, and there were platforms in place where the pyramids stand. Not the pyramids as we see them today, but the base of those pyramids was already in place at that time.
So what's the case? What's the evidence that the Egyptologists use to make the attributions that they do for the dating of the pyramids and the Sphinx?
Well, the three great pyramids of Giza are different from later pyramids. This is another problem that I have with the whole thing. Is the story of pyramid building? When did it really begin? And the timeline that we get from Egyptology is the first pyramid is the pyramid of the pharaoh Zoser, the step pyramid at Saqqara, about 100 years or so before the Giza pyramids are built. And then we have this explosion in the fourth dynasty of true pyramids. We have three of them attributed to a single pharaoh, Sneferu, who built supposedly the pyramid at Maidum and the two pyramids at Dashur, the bent and the red pyramid. And then within that same 100-year span, we have the Giza pyramids being built. This is according to the Orthodox chronology. Yeah. And then suddenly, once the Giza project is finished, pyramid building goes into a massive slump in ancient Egypt. And the pyramids of the fifth dynasty are, frankly speaking, a mess outside. They're very inferior constructions. You can hardly recognize them as pyramids at all. But what happens when you go inside them is you find that they're extensively covered in hieroglyphs and imagery, repeating the name of the king who was supposedly buried in that place. Whereas the Giza pyramids have no internal inscriptions whatsoever. What we do have.
Sure, yeah, I mean, it's a good point that it's presenting to challenge the ideas that we have when it comes to Egyptology and chronology of pyramid building and construction. It is absolutely legitimate for him to say that. Also, let's keep in mind that there could be, if we want to use Occam Razor, a much easier explanation, which could be a difference in power, shift in political priorities, so reallocation of funds, and last but not least, cultural changes. All of these happen within 100 years. It does happen. And therefore, it could be as simple as that. They don't want to justify the same amount of funds allocated to monumental construction as they did before. And when it comes to the changes of decoration inside, lack of hieroglyphs against presence, intense presence of hieroglyphs could also be a cultural shift. I mean, look at how different pre-communist China is after communist China, or even the difference in 100 years between the Ming dynasty and then the Mongolian dynasty before that. Like there is a lot of change that can happen in 100 years when it comes to customs and values. So that could also be an Occam Razor explanation. So I'm not necessarily saying that he's wrong. I'm not a hater. I'm just someone who likes to discuss, but I'm just presenting, sort of playing the devil's advocate a little bit.
Is one piece of graffiti about which there is some controversy. Basic statistics, it's a 6 million ton structure. Each side is about 750 feet long. Yeah. It's aligned almost perfectly to true north, south, east, and west, within 3/60ths of a single degree. 60ths because degrees are divided into 60s. It's the precision of the orientation and the absolute massive size of the thing, plus its very complicated internal passageways that are involved in it. You know, in the 9th century, the Great Pyramid still had its facing stones in place.
Yeah, true.
But there was an Arab caliph, Caliph al-Mamun, who had already realized that other pyramids did have their entrances in the north face. Nobody knew where the entrance to the Great Pyramid was. But he figured, there's an entrance to this thing. It's going to be in the north face somewhere. So he put together a team of workers, and they went in with sledgehammers, and they started smashing where he thought would be the entrance. And they cut their way into the Great Pyramid for a distance of maybe 100 feet. And then the hammering that they did dislodged something. They heard a little bit further away something big falling, and they realized there was a cavity there, and they started heading in that direction. And then they joined the internal passageway of the Great Pyramid, the descending and the ascending corridors that go up. When you go up the ascending corridor, every one of the internal passageways in the Great Pyramid that people can walk in slopes at an angle of 26 degrees. That's interesting because the angle of slope of the exterior of the Great Pyramid is 52 degrees. So we know mathematicians were at work as well as geometers.
Yeah. Well, of course.
In the creation of the Great.
They would be, absolutely. Even Roman engineers were well versed in mathematics. You have to be able to build with precision.
Pyramid. If you go up the Grand Gallery, which is at the end of the so-called ascending corridor, and it's above the so-called Queen's Chamber. You go up the Grand Gallery, you're eventually going to come to what is known as the King's Chamber, in which there is a sarcophagus. And that sarcophagus is a little bit too big to have been got in through the narrow entrance passageway. It's almost as though the so-called King's Chamber was built around the sarcophagus already in place. Above the King's Chamber are 5 other chambers. These are known as relieving chambers. The theory was that they were built to relieve the pressure on the King's Chamber of the weight of the monument. But I think what makes that theory dubious is the fact that even lower down, where more weight was involved, you have the Queen's Chamber, and there are no such relieving chambers above that. In the top of these 5 chambers, a British adventurer and vandal called Howard Vyse, who dynamited his way into those chambers in the first place, allegedly found, well, he claims he found the graffiti, a piece of graffiti left by a work gang naming the Pharaoh Khufu. And it's true, I've been in that chamber, and there is the cartouche of Khufu there, quite recognizable. But the dispute around it is whether that is a genuine piece of graffiti dating from the Old Kingdom, or whether Howard Vyse actually put it there himself because he was in desperate need of money at the time. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Another reason why, but it's one of the reasons that...
Can you imagine, like, if you were, not that I like the idea that they drilled inside the pyramid, but I mean, can you imagine if you were part of that first team that found the entrance to the pyramids, and now you're walking through corridors that haven't been walked for who knows how long? I mean, if Egyptology is correct, maybe 4,000 years 4,000 years old, but if he's right, 10,000 years old, regardless, thousands of years old. Imagine if you go down those corridors and you know that no man has in such a long time, and you have no idea what you're going to find in there. Imagine if you're a superstitious man. Goodness gracious, that would be, what an adventure. It's like literally Tomb Raider.
That Egyptologists feel confident in saying that the pyramid is the work of Khufu. Another is what is called the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, where on the Red Sea, a diary, the diary of an individual called Merer, was found, and he talks about bringing highly polished limestone to the Great Pyramid. And it's clear that what he's talking about is the facing stones of the Great Pyramid. He's not talking about the body of the Great Pyramid. He's talking about the facing stones of the Great Pyramid during the reign of Khufu. So that's another reason why the Great Pyramid is attributed to Khufu. But I think that Khufu was undoubtedly involved in the Great Pyramid, and in a big way, but I think he was building upon and elaborating a much older structure. And I think the heart of that structure is the subterranean chamber, which is a 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. Anybody who suffers from claustrophobia will not enjoy being down there. You got to go down a 26-degree sloping corridor until a distance of about 300 feet. It's 100 feet vertically, but the slope means you're going to walk a distance of about, not walk, you're going to ape walk. You're almost going to have to crawl. I've learned from long experience that the best way to go down these corridors is actually backwards. If you go forward, you keep bumping your head on them because they're only 3 feet 5 inches high. You get down to the bottom, you have a short horizontal passage.
Not a
and
chance.
Then you get into the subterranean chamber. The theory of Egyptology is that this was supposed to be the burial place of Khufu. But after cutting out that 300-foot-long, 26-degree sloping passage lot of which passes through bedrock, and having cut the subterranean chamber out of bedrock, gone to all that trouble, they decided they wouldn't bury him there, and they built what's now known as the Queen's Chamber as his burial chamber. But then they decided that wouldn't do either, so they then built the King's Chamber, and that's where the pharaoh is supposed to have been buried. Those Arab raiders under Caliph Mamun didn't find anything in the Great Pyramid at all.
So your idea is that...
Well, it could be that... That's a very good point.
The Sphinx and maybe some aspects of the pyramid were much earlier.
Yes.
And why that's important is, in that case, it would be evidence of some transfer of technology
Yes.
from a much older civilization. The idea is that during the Younger Dryas, most of that civilization was either destroyed or damaged, and they desperately scattered across the globe,
Seeking refuge.
and telling stories of maybe the importance of the stars, their knowledge about the stars, and their knowledge about building and knowledge about navigation.
That's roughly the idea. So it's interesting that the ancient Egyptians have a notion of an epoch that they call Zep-Tepi, which is the first time. It means the first time. This is when the gods walked the earth. This is when 7 sages brought wisdom to ancient Egypt.
Very interesting that he's 7 sages, because we also have the 7 weapons, the gods of destructions that are mentioned in the Sumero-Akkadian religious texts. So there is a recurrence of number 7 in there, which I find fascinating.
And that is seen as the origin of ancient Egyptian civilization. There are king lists by the ancient Egyptians themselves. There are king lists that go back way beyond the first dynasty, go back 30,000 years into the past in ancient Egypt, considered to be entirely mythical by Egyptologists. But nevertheless, it's interesting that there's that reference to remote time. Now, what you also have in Egypt are what might almost be described as secret societies.
Okay, so I'm interested, rather than the secret societies, I'm interested in this, how the Great Pyramid was built. Let's see what this theory is.
If you look into the future, maybe the next 100 years, what do you hope are the interesting discoveries in archaeology that we'll find?
Well, I'd really like to know how the Great Pyramid was built.
I see.
And we now have, with new tech, with scanning technology, it's now become apparent that there are many major voids within the Great Pyramid. Right above the Grand Gallery, there's what looks like a second Grand Gallery that has been identified with remote scanning. And new chambers, one of them has even been opened up already, are being found as a result of this. So it may be that the Great Pyramid will ultimately give up its secrets. I often think that the Great Pyramid is partly designed to do that. It's designed to invite its own initiates. Some people aren't interested in the Great Pyramid at all, but some people are fascinated by it, and they're drawn towards it. And when they're drawn towards it, it immediately starts raising questions in their minds, and they seek answers to their questions. So it's like saying...
Yeah, it feels a bit like pattern recognition that we do have as humans. We have the tendency to see patterns even when there is none. To me, the idea of, the pyramid is there because it wants to teach you stuff, but you got to look for it. Sounds nice, but...
Here I stand. Investigate me.
Yeah,
find out about me. Figure out what I am. Why have I got these 2 shafts cut into the side of the so-called Queen's Chamber?
Why didn't they just tell us then? That's the part that I don't understand to this approach, which I know some people... Why making it so you have to investigate it in order to get... maybe you'll have an idea for this. I just find it difficult. It's either you want to keep it secret to me and you don't want people to understand. You don't care, and all of this is just the fact that you can discover some things and not discover some things is coincidental, and at the end of the day, they didn't care. Or they want you to know, but if they do want you to know, then why hiding it? Like, imagine if we are about to experience a cataclysmic event, and we're like, we want generations in 2,000 years from now, after the ruins of our civilizations. We want them to be able to still build computers. Do you think we would try to preserve a full manual that tries to explain people how to build a computer for their own sake? Or do you think we would make it into a puzzle that only if you really, really, really want to know, you'll be able to figure it out? But otherwise, yeah, no, sorry, because you have to first decode this, and then we put a reference, but you can only understand it if you can see the solar eclipse. I mean, yeah.
Why do they slope up through the body of the Great Pyramid? Why do they not exit on the outside of the Great Pyramid? Why?
But then again, to quote myself, maybe that's something that people in the past did. Because at the end of the day, perhaps I'm applying my own logic. It's just that it doesn't make sense to me that they want to reveal, but they have to do it as a puzzle. Now, that sounds like something that sells well to the audience.
Why, when we send a robot up those shafts, do we find them after about 160 feet blocked by a door with metal handles? Why, when we drill through that door to see what's beyond it, 3 or 4 feet away, we see another door? It's like very frustrating, but it's saying to us, keep on exploring. If you're
And Mr. Hancock, I don't know. I think you're seeing too much into this. If they have multiple doors, it's because they want to make it harder to get to whatever thing there is inside there. It's not because they're like, oh, I'm putting a door because I want you to not give up. I mean, keep exploring. It's sorry, but no.
Persistent
I don't
enough,
see it.
We'll eventually give you the answer. So I'm
I
hoping
don't see
that
it.
answer will come.
I
As
don't
to
see
how
it.
this most mysterious of monuments was actually built and the inspiration that lay behind it. Certainly, I'm sure it was never a tomb or a tomb only. The later pyramids might have been. Actually, no pharaonic burial has been discovered in any pyramid, but nevertheless, it's pretty clear that the later pyramids, with the pyramid texts written on the walls, like the Pyramid of Unas, 5th Dynasty pyramid at Saqqara, were tombs. But the Great Pyramid, to go to that length to create a tomb, to make it a scale model of the Earth, to orient it perfectly to true north, to make it 6 million tons. This is not a tomb. This is something else. This is a curiosity device. This is something that is asking us to understand it. And I hope we will understand it. And I hope Egyptologists will.
Well, I think the idea that it's Galamia. Well, the idea that a pyramid is not just a tomb, I agree with that. A pyramid is also a symbol of power. It is made majestic and enormous also as a way to psychologically control the masses. At the end of the day, and I say this as a religious man, but at the end of the day, the reason why our cathedrals within Christianity are so massive are to make you feel small, as the single individual person is supposed to not feel at the same height as the people that have the authority of people in power. At the end of the day, I agree with him, the pyramid is not just a tomb, it is a symbol of power, it is a tool for mass control, but I don't know if he means something else. Like, I don't know if he means that if he's one of those people that believe that maybe it was some kind of spaceport, or if it's some kind of map for space travel, pointers, or if it's a power plant. All of that, I find it fascinating, and I could watch documentaries and stuff talking about this for hours in a row, because I love it the same way I love science fiction. But it does remain science fiction unless documented evidence actually changes it and transports it into the realm of science, which, if it does, then I'll always be open-minded. If they can prove it, I'll be like, okay, great. It was a power plant, and it was used to dock spaceships from a civilization that came from Orion. I can't disprove it, so I'm not going to say it's absolutely impossible that that's what happened. Maybe it is what happened. But of course, at this point, the simple idea that there is a couple of sets of doors, from that, I don't think it's enough to prove it, but it is nice to talk about it, which is why I do appreciate this interview, and I appreciate every single one of you watching here. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching the Metatron's channel, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.